Welcome to Governing Conversations. I'm Professor Ann Washington, founder of the Digital Interest Lab at New York University, and co-created by my lab, the Information Society Project at Yale Law School. The Governing Conversation series provides reflection and critical perspectives on how we organize societies in light of emerging technologies. David Morar, my NSF career postdoc and the NYU Digital Interest Lab manager, initiated the series. And oh, by the way, last call, I'm hiring 2 new postdocs, deadline in about a week. We're at the 3rd event for the Access and Accessibility series, which is in collaboration with American University, both its Institute on Disability and Public Policy and its Internet Governance Lab. And we start a new series in a few weeks on cybersecurity. I'm going to leave you in the hands of our very, very capable moderator for today. Lydia X. V. Brown, pronouns they, them, is Policy Counsel at the Center for Democracy and Technology. Lydia, we're off to you.
Hello, this is Lydia, pronouns they, them. I'm a youngish East Asian person with short black and teal hair, today wearing a teal polo shirt and glasses, and behind me is a fake background that purports to have me in a gorgeous room with soaring glass windows, bookcases that go up the walls, and a ladder to access those hard to reach books, which is my dream. Today, I am extremely excited to introduce 3 fantastic researchers, advocates, and badasses. First, I would like to introduce Payal Arora, who is a digital anthropologist, author, speaker, and professor. Payal is chair of Technology, Values, and Global Media Cultures at Erasmus University, Rotterdam. She's co-founder of FemLab Co., a feminist future of work initiative, and her work is focused on user experience of and inclusive design for low-income communities worldwide. Next, I'd like to introduce Katie Pierce. Katie is Associate Professor of Communication at the University of Washington. She researches social and political uses of technologies and digital content with a focus on semi and fully authoritarian states of the former Soviet Union. Her current research includes digital divides and inequalities, affordances of information and communication technologies for social and opposition movements, and online impression management. And last, but absolutely not least, I'd like to introduce Andre Brock, Associate Professor of Media Studies at Georgia Tech. Andre's award-winning book, Distributed Blackness, African-American Cybercultures, theorizes Black everyday lives as Black joy, mediated by networked digital technologies. I am so excited for our conversation. And before we get started, I wanted to make sure to lay a little bit of groundwork to make sure we're all on the same page. The title of our conversation today is on digital divide, culture, and intersectionality. And while many of you who are here joining us are probably conversant in the theory and analysis of intersectionality, for those who aren't and who are thinking, oh no, I've heard this word, but I don't really know exactly what it means, I'm going to spell it out a little bit. The word intersectionality has come to public consciousness largely through the work of critical race legal scholar and feminist advocate Kimberly Williams Crenshaw from the early 1990s. And Professor Crenshaw's work on intersectionality proposed a mode of analysis of structural and systemic discrimination, what we often call marginalization or oppression, that occurs when more than one form of systematic discrimination collides with, compounds with another, and operates to produce particular and unique experiences of systematic discrimination that occur at the intersections. Professor Crenshaw's work originally focused specifically on the experiences of Black women experiencing discrimination both on the basis of gender and race, but discrimination that couldn't be described as simply additive, race plus gender-based discrimination, but rather as compounded particular discrimination that was specific to the experience of Black womanhood, a term later called by Trudy and Moya Bailey misogynoir. the experience of oppression that occurs at the intersections. In the work that each of us does today, those of us who are participating in this conversation, intersectionality helps us to understand and to analyze what happens when more than one form of systematic discrimination or marginalization collide to produce, reproduce, perpetuate, exacerbate, and accelerate particularized and specific forms of social, political, and economic exclusion, marginalization, erasure, violence, and other forms of oppression. In my work, it shows up in particular through my work for 15 years as a community organizer and advocate rooted in disability justice praxis. Intersectionality as a mode of analysis is the first principle of disability justice as articulated by Patty Byrne and other co-creators of the DJ framework. And what that means is that in my work to address algorithmic injustice, technology injustice, and the ways in which disabled people experience compounded marginalization and oppression from the margins of the margins, it is impossible for me to do my work without educating and uplifting the ways in which ableism itself is dependent on and necessary for all other modalities of oppression and marginalization. Understanding the crisis, as well as understanding the path forward, requires an intersectional analysis. And so I turn to each of you to pose our first question for today. How does intersectionality, as this mode of analysis and framing, influence your approach to technology justice? And Payal, we'll start with you.
Sure. Firstly, thank you so much for the invite, and I'm really happy to see this excellent panel and a great choice of topics. So very timely, undoubtedly. And I think this intersectionality is an amazing concept which can be laid very well across different cultures and contexts. In my case, I've been looking particularly at the Indian context and low-income women workers and how they are, using different sort of platforms and digital tools to become part of the workspace. Now, this has become very alarming because in the last few years, a couple of things have happened in India. Is that women in 2018 started to drop from the digital uptake, so they started to decline, right? And then on top of it, in 2019 there were less women going to work into the workspace, so it was a double whammy. And then the pandemic hit, and that exponentially expanded that sort of marginalization and invisibility in the workspace and the public sphere. So we founded, Usha Raman, who's from University of Hyderabad, and myself founded this organization called FemLab, which puts basically low-income women workers, and we very closely look, and it's not just class, it's also caste, in particularly in India, right? And in terms of religion, because of the Hindutva, politics going on in India. So it comes up with this layers and as exactly what Lydia says, is this amplified, compounded forms of marginalization in access and usage of these platforms. So that's where we've been actually looking at. And what's been interesting, just a few takeaways, is that we've been looking across sectors, from the construction sector, ride hailing, artisanal sector, so 6 different sectors. And we found common patterns. One of the very alarming patterns was that many of the women who are in these sectors don't see themselves as workers. While they are engaged in work across board, they don't recognize themselves as workers because it's considered, they're delegitimizing themselves, as they see it as something they do on the side, whether it's artisanal work, partly because of their sites of working, so if you're an artisanal worker, you're at home trying to take care of your kids, you're cooking, and you're working on the bangle making. And so you don't see that and recognize that as legitimate work and contribution. So we notice the sites of workspace determines the identities, of who we are as a worker and a worker being. And I think that was actually very interesting because, especially in this conversation of remote working, right? Women have always been remote working. It's not the pandemic in many ways in these contexts. And so here, these are like even much more invisibilized. And the other trend, I think, is like, and I'll just stop there because I'm sure others have interesting insights in the ride hailing sector, is that, you know, mobility has been so closely tied with gender equality and its mobility in through public space, right? And, you know, so what has been a problem in the ride hailing sectors is a huge scarcity of women drivers. So we've been looking very closely at, like, you know, these movements, these feminist movements like She Taxi and all these, which are for women, driven by women, because women feel comfortable with women drivers. But there's a huge stigma of the reputation of a woman driver, because after all, she's so loose that she moves around with strangers. And actually, Katie also has done some really cool work. I mean, on this in terms of, you know, women and engagement with the strangers and the stigmatization around that. And so there's an ongoing challenge of scalability. So we found it very interesting because we took on a stakeholder analysis, and a lot of them said we can't scale. We have to go, you know, manual. It's not algorithmic because we can't attract. If we create a high demand and we feed into it and take venture capital funding, it doesn't matter because we can't get that kind of number of drivers because of the cultural stigma. So these are just examples and challenges of what, you know, it's not so much of technological issues as much as social cultural challenges and barriers that are sort of reinvigorated with the sort of doubling down of the patriarchal system alongside the Hindutva sort of ideology, which comes up with a very sort of puritanical notion of the future Indian woman, you know, which is something we have to confront in today's day and age if we are to include them genuinely into not just the workspace, into everyday society, basically, right? So anyway, I will stop right there.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Payal. And I dropped some links into the chat for some resources on intersectionality, including in addressing Hindutva harassment of activists speaking against Hindutva as an ideology. Andre, I'd love to turn to you next.
I'll actually defer and let Katie go before me because I'm about to start some shit. I mean, trouble. And I want to
say shit all the time. My ring literally says fuck.
I want to let the smart people go first, and then I'll come through with my ill-formed opinions.
You were brilliant, Andre, and not ill-informed at all. But Katie, go ahead.
All right. Well, maybe I'll try to start some shit, and you know, you can continue the path rolling. Thanks, everyone. This is such a great group of people to be discussing this with too, and I think that starting with discussing intersectionality versus talking about what is digital divide is really appropriate for this group of people too. That digital divide, digital inequality, digital inequity is really important, but this is all occurring within existing oppressions that exist in society, regardless of technology or digital content being part of it. So it's really important that we are centering these core relationships. And I think some of the most interesting work is when we actually are trying to tease out under what circumstances is technology amplifying existing inequalities? When is it providing opportunities for people to engage in resistance? When is it doing both simultaneously is the most interesting, I think. But yeah, I think at its core, that coming back to what exactly is it that technology is creating barriers to, what is it that technology is potentially allowing access to, recenters our work. And a great deal of digital divide and inequality work are sort of these big quantitative studies that are like, okay, you know, such a percentage of non-use or non-access of technology is due to this demographic variable. And those studies are great. And I'm glad people are doing that kind of work. But I think that when we can get at the nuance, doing more qualitative, more ethnographic work, that can allow us to really see sort of these challenges that exist. And I know, so in my work, I study societies like Payal just explained, talking about the women that in the artisanal sector and the women that are engaging in driving and other forms of labor, in societies in which there are so many different ways that people are denied access to resources and opportunities that they may want to engage in to better their lives. And that there was a lot of initial hope and a lot of optimism, 15, 20 years ago, that somehow technology was going to allow these sort of processes to happen faster, whether it be democratization or access to particular resources or liberation or bringing down the patriarchy. But we've seen time and time again that it's more of a chipping away than it is, a tearing down of the wall. And so in my work, I wish I had more opportunities to have positive examples, right? Like people would always love to hear like, oh yeah, and then, they got online and they overthrew that dictator and it was great. But that's just not the case. And so I am throwing out there that more nuance is better, and that more discussions between people that are studying different contexts is really important, because then we can share ideas and share perspectives. And yeah, so I think when we get to our next question where we talk about digital divide, I have some other thoughts about definitional, but I would love to hear what kind of shit Dre wants to raise at this point, and maybe that'll take us down a different path.
Also, usually shit stirrer is my responsibility on calls, but as the moderator, I suppose I should attempt to refrain.
Nah, go ahead. All right. So I love intersectionality as a theoretical approach. It features prominently in distributed Blackness when I talk about Black techno culture, but I come at it at a slightly different angle than the original Patricia Hill Collins, Kimberly Crenshaw formulation. And in part it's because of something I realized a long time ago, that racism or oppression does not overdetermine what my identity is. And so for me, the matrix of oppression is a super valuable construct to unpack the differential ways in which violence can be applied across multiple categories inherent in the body of a person. But I needed more because I asked this question on Twitter with the Twitter account that I don't have the other day: what would an intersectionality of pleasure look like? Right. And so my concern with intersectionality, I ride with the Collins and Crenshaw definitions, but I also use one by Bra and Phoenix, where they talk about intersectionality as a series of relations between identities, a series of tensions. And in many ways that works well for me, given what my theoretical approach to the digital is these days, which is libidinal economy, right? So if I look at it as a series of relations, suddenly intersectionality isn't only reserved for Black women. I can interrogate white middle-class folk. I can interrogate Asian immigrants and their children to the United States, right? Because all those things are not constructed of oppressions, right? All that you have to take into account the privileges that are, I should have used that word, I hate that word. You have to take into account the other things that make up their identities above and beyond the oppressions that they encounter within a particular structure, right? And that kind of leads me to my understanding of the digital divide as well. The digital divide is an unhelpful concept to me because it's based on a deficit model structured on how Western techno culture feels that technology should be distributed. Right. And my brilliant panelists whose work I've heard at conferences before have done a lot to highlight that if you instead study technology use and adoption from the perspective of the understudied, of the minoritized, you begin to find that while they understand they are enmeshed in a context that is intent upon keeping them from certain resources, their creativity, their ingenuity, their desire to thrive and live makes them build out alternative technology models. And we can then begin to understand that the digital divide is largely where the West wants us to stay, as opposed to understanding that we bring our own solutions to the particular thing. So not really talking super shit, but just I know that once this recording gets out, the Black feminists will get at me, because that's happened before. But just to reiterate, intersectionality should be understood as not just the factors which lead to your oppression in a particular construct, but also the resources that you marshal in order to vivify yourself against modernity, capitalism, and imperialism, right? Because without those, once the oppression is gone, what type of person will you be? And I'll leave it there.
This is Lydia. I'm not sure how that's stirring shit at all. And I feel like we could just have like a whole other 5-hour conversation about this. When I talk about intersectionality with my students, I teach about the ways in which an intersectional analysis helps us understand relationships of power. Having access or proximity to power, as well as being deprived of power, and what marginalized, subordinated, and oppressed communities have always done to resist empire, to resist oppression, and to build and to sustain lives, lifeways, communities, culture, and futures beyond and past the limiting constraints of white-centric capitalist modes of thinking and building. So I feel like you're muted.
What if you take resistance out of that?
Right, and so resistance is what we're dealing with now in relation to capital and empire, and liberation in our future is what we're building for and now for our future and our present, past, beyond, and outside of, I can't even use prepositions anymore, outside of the present reality and the structures that seek to keep us forever entangled within them and related to them.
So I'll stop here with this last comment, because I know we have a lot of stuff to discover. But my concern is that people often seem to believe that liberation signals some utopian state where we will no longer have oppression, right? But it doesn't realize that in any society larger than 3 people, people construct categories upon which to differentiate themselves from one another, and that leads to redistribution of power resources, right? So there are no non-innocent infrastructures. So focusing attention on what you need to do to overcome this power structure is super important. But you also need to be able to theorize who you were before you encountered that structure, if that's possible, and who you will be after that structure. And that's the part where I'm focused on in this work.
And I think, you and I, like, there's a lot to build here and to talk about, and I would love to have that conversation. And right, and I also spent a lot of time recently talking about how the framing of liberation as this utopia is also a very white-centric, Christian-centric idea of what a utopia is supposed to be. But I digress. Many of you talked about this in different ways already just in the last several minutes about challenging the concept of what a digital divide is. And, Andre, you talked about the idea of digital divide as reinforcing a Western-centric concept of access to resources being mediated through one means only. Katie, you've talked about in your work the way in which digital divide is a misnomer, and it fails to capture the many ways in which people who are marginalized and subordinated are actively deprived of, by design, access to resources, knowledge on so many different levels, beyond simply whether someone has access to a particular piece of technology. And Payal, you talked also about the ways in which how we understand and think about technology can't be limited simply to one particular context, right? That you focus outside of the US Western context. Your work is focused on the Indian context and on marginalized communities within India that do not fundamentally interact with the idea or framing of technology or technology justice in the same way as technologists who are operating in a white Western context do. So the next question that I want to pose to all of you is if you could further extract what should we be talking about when we consider the quote unquote digital divide? What does that actually mean? Should we be framing this conversation differently? If digital divide is the wrong framing to begin with, then what should the framing actually be of talking about technological injustice? And whoever would like to address that first, open question. And, again, we could probably spend hours on this.
This is one of my little soapboxes. So if I can just say a couple things to start about this. It's unfortunate that this term digital divide emerged in the 1990s and stuck. It's a really terrible term. And every time I have to add it as a keyword for in a publication for the purposes of search, even though I'm like, oh, I hate this term, it just pains me. But this is stuck. And it's unfortunate because that metaphor of a divide is just so inappropriate. And so a lot of people prefer to say inequalities or inequities, but certainly, that term divide sticks. And I think one of the big problems with it is that I imagine for a lot of people in the audience that, they know this term digital divide, but they don't think about it all the time, that material access is what comes immediately to mind. Does that kid have access to a computer? Does that woman in some faraway place have access to a mobile phone? It's that material access. And we know, although certainly material access, it remains a problem nowadays, that it's far less of an issue, that we need to also be thinking about issues of access beyond material and thinking about skills, ongoing maintenance costs. You can have a phone, but if you can't top up the minutes, what's the point? If you can't charge it with power, what's the point? And now, increasingly, as things are digital, applying for jobs, applying for public assistance, et cetera, this matters even more. And I think one of the, it's a little cliche, but one of the things that the pandemic put a spotlight on is that material access doesn't solve the problems. Schools across the world gave kids Chromebooks or laptops or tablets when things turned to remote learning, but a lot of families couldn't have internet access on. And so you had many children who weren't able to access their education during that time. In 2020, we saw this happening. And so being able to think about that there are a multitude of divides that exist, and also that oftentimes when we start talking about digital divide, we get into these like single variable explanations, right? Like they'll say, 37% of Latinx kids don't have access to home internet or something. And they're not getting into intersectional identities within that. They're not looking at the multitude of factors, looking at economics, looking at being rural, looking at being in a digital desert, et cetera. So it's really, really problematic. I'm going to put a link in the chat to Ellen Helpser's book. She's a British scholar who wrote a really good publicly accessible book a couple of years ago called The Digital Disconnect. And I think she does a really nice job of matching sort of this more divide framework, thinking about how it's more complicated and how the term divide isn't excellent. So I just want to kind of put that out there, that reframing our definitions is a really important first step. So I'm going to step off my soapbox, and if others want to share their grumbling about this term, I'm sure others feel the same.
Yeah, I can chime in here. Absolutely, we need to get rid of the term, but we can't, because actually a lot of development agencies, aid agencies use this as a go-to for funding. And if we want to speak to people who are actually structuring change, funders who are channeling money, we have to, use that common language, right? And through that, we are hoping to build nuance, tensions, and, enlighten them that that's not a great idea. So, in my book, The Next Billion Users, I write a whole section of like how we need less innovation. And partly because I'm arguing about this notion that a lot of the global south is used as a live laboratory, because when you talk about the divide, you have a very clear concept of the haves and the have-nots, and thereby if only you cross that line, like Andre says, you have this the utopia, right? You've reached that positive end, which is actually both can coexist, right? For example, you want to be digitally included, so it is wonderful to celebrate. So anyone who's traveled through the global South will recognize the absolute, optimism of, the Gen Z, etc., getting online, unlike, say, if you speak to those in the US, for example, right, where they completely feel like they're being oppressed by social media, the world's going to shit, like democracy is coming to an end, where you talk to a kid in, Malawi or, Mumbai slum, and they're like, we love Facebook, all right? I mean, it's like saving our lives. I mean, so the thing though is, on the other hand, so they are being included because they don't get to express themselves in ways that otherwise we all take for granted, because they're in conservative cultures, they have 3 jobs in the day, they don't have the time, etc. So there's a lot of family pressure. So this is their little moments of self-actualization and more privacy, right? I mean, this is the irony, is like we all think, oh my god, being online is like oppressive because it's taking away our privacy. For them, it's giving them more privacy in relation to the fact that they're sharing a 1-bedroom home with 3 generations with like zero actual physical privacy. So going back to what Andrea is talking about, is like, it's about relations, and you can have both, the negatives, because then they're also part of the data inclusion, right? So they're being extracted as they're being included. So you can have both realities and truths at the same time, right? And I mean, the part of this like argument I made in my book about like these live laboratories is, when you have the haves and have-nots, it's an infinite basically cycle of consumption that we're subscribing to, which really helps technology companies to continue to upgrade, continue to come up with more products and services. Only the governments with extraordinarily limited resources can put, like the classic case of the 1 laptop per child. It's an old case, but Jesus, that guy still sits on the innovation boards across the countries. I mean, he is shaping innovation as we speak, right? Negroponte, Elon Musk, Sugata Mitra have done so much of damage. There's so much empirical evidence proving they're wrong, and yet they are on almost all the innovation boards on how the future of tech going to be like, right? So they subscribe to the notion of solutionism, that you can replace entire institutions with an app. I mean, I was hired by UNESCO to check out the effectiveness of the sort of prize giving, entities and funding. And alarmingly, a lot of entrepreneurs were desperately trying to say how they can replace a school, how they can replace healthcare, how they can replace every goddamn institution with an app, because they can win that damn prize, right? And so there's this rush for it, and it's particularly happening in global South context, where there's weaker institutions, where you can't the rights are much more looser, right? I mean, just look at Facebook. They have double standards reassuring Europeans, don't worry, your data is secure, when they decided to share encrypted like WhatsApp data with an Instagram data and merge it all in one. But that's fine for the Indians, right? I mean, that's okay. I mean, so there's literally double standards. So this idea that they test their products, and you see even with now WorldCoin and all these other crypto, initiatives, they're literally taking an orb, walking around different countries in the global South, indiscriminately collecting data through these without consent, all in the name of altruism, saying it's all for good. So you don't hear that rhetoric in the West of like, I'm technology for good. They don't say that ever. Like, it's mainly for the global South, the poor people that are blank slate, that have nothing to lose, right? So it's almost like culture is sort of like flattened, and then technology is really amplified as finally we can modernize them. So there is a real issue with all of this. And, I do think what would be much more useful than digital divide is digital dignities. We need to look at it just like rights, right? We have a conversation on rights. Let's have a benchmark of what are the essentials, as Katie is also talking about, is, now it's not a choice. It's mandatory. For us to live, we need to have a digital presence. Even when we are off, we are still online anyway, right? Whether if you need access to welfare, whatever, it's happening, and it'll continue exponentially happening. So we need to have digital dignity as a benchmark. What does it require? you know, what are the safeguards too? Because here it's all about consumption, not about regulation, not about, you know, governance. Exactly the topic of this panel. How are these technologies governed on the so-called the other side of the divide, right? And if it's not governed at all, then you're basically going into a trap of further exploiting yourself and your entire communities, and maybe making yourself worse off. So yeah, let's talk about digital dignities and let's start to build on what is it required, which institutes should come on board, you know, from a legal perspective, obviously not just a tech solutionism perspective, right? Technology may play a minor part, but technology problems are rarely fixed with technological solutions, and we know that. So it's about, like, you know, ongoing collectivities, but translating, and it's you know very well, Lydia, it's like you need to go into the office and like actually get real power, right? So like, let's get that into a legislation, let's get that into formalization, you know, let's get that into code, you know, and try, yeah. So there's a lot of work to be done, but we need to start with identifying what constitutes as digital dignity. How do we build that? Who do we need to involve? And let's make it a global enterprise, not a global north south, right? And I think then we'd be having a very productive conversation.
Dre, did you want to add anything?
My fantastic panelists have done this. I don't even need to say nothing.
I'm also just thinking this whole time as Katie and Pyle are talking, like every time somebody says digital divide, I do want to cry a little bit. I want to cry a little bit. Well, you know, in our next part of our conversation, you know, and we're already starting to gesture toward this part of the conversation, I wanted to ask each of you, what are some techno solutionist policy proposals that we should always oppose, and why? And I'm asking this question very intentionally, right? Because people always want to hear about what should we do, and we're going to talk about that. I hope we can talk about that. But we also need to be really clear for folks who care and who are thinking, well, I care about justice, I care about equity, I care about not buying into white-centric, capitalist, colonizing approaches to problems that affect real people and real people's lives. But what are things that I should be aware of that sound great, right? But are actually proposals or quote unquote reforms that I should be opposing?
I'll start, even though this is not directly my field of expertise, but I have some thoughts. So one of the comments in the chat brought to mind the very concept of a bridge over a divide. So throughout human history, anyone who controls a bridge or a ford over a chasm, I'm sorry, I pronounced that wrong, a chasm, a river, or anywhere is in control of access to the other side, right? And in the history of digital divide policies and implementations, that bridge is never positioned as something where the stakeholders who are most in need of crossing that divide are in control of that particular bridge. It's always someone else who's in control of that. And that's specific, right? When we talk about Facebook and its one initiative in multiple places, Facebook wanted to be in control of that bridge across the divide because it saw immense profit in being able to extract and exploit. Right. And so that leads me to my second point. I argue frequently that modernity, which is where we are at this point, is in alignment with this partner capitalism, is intent on extracting resources from the human to build records of people as if those records are people themselves. Right. And if you build those records, now the techno solutionists claim, if I simply get enough data on how people act, do, think, move, I can then tell you what those people will do, right? And many digital divide initiatives that are being phrased at this point are like, we need more data, we need more data. What will be done with that data? As Payal said really, really well, right? What are the possibilities for those folk who are giving up their data? What do they gain in return? What is their benefit, right? What is the thing that they will get in addition to, I'm sorry, I'm paraphrasing you incorrectly, Payal. But let me just go forth with this. Any quote unquote digital divide policy that does not put at the forefront the concerns of the stakeholders most in need of the resources that are supposedly being kept from them from the digital divide is a problem. Right. I think, and this is a really old example, because again, I'm not deep in the literature, when the Basque government in Spain decided that it would do Linux distros and use open access software instead of Microsoft products, that was a signal move that was pushed back upon immediately by Microsoft and other corporations, because it meant that there were open source resources that these folks could use and prosper with, conduct the everyday business of life without having to pay Microsoft money. Right. And I think one of the things the digital divide does best is disguise the immense policy decisions that are orchestrated by lobbyists for these tech companies and the nations that support them in order to make sure that digital divide is maintained, right? So techno-solutionism, keep the companies out of it as best you can. Make transparent the policies that led to this deficit in the first place. It should not be solely on, oh, those poor people need our help. What policies were put into place to make sure that rural folk didn't have access to particular types of connectivity, or that certain smartphones can be sold in this country and others cannot, right? Or that cameras can be used in certain parts of the country and others cannot. Those are not things that individuals have decreed. Those are things that governments and companies decide on their own. And so if we make more transparent the decisions that went into why we have this problem in the first place, I think that's something that can be addressed when we're talking about solutions for this particular problem.
Yeah, I mean, just to actually, for me, it's not about what we should, absolutely be against, because what's really, really difficult is that it comes with the good and bad all meshed in. For example, okay, concretely, locked profiles. This feature by Facebook and a number of other platforms was a response to the growing misogyny online and harassment. And so particularly in global South context, so they like, okay, because often it could also result in real death threats, like for female journalists, and actually, it was bodily harm. So, in very conservative societies and patriarchal societies. So, Facebook and other tech companies said, all right, we need to fix it. We can't fix culture right away. So let's do lock profiles, which, was interesting because a lot of the feminist groups in India celebrated it as a moment. And I understand why, because they were like, you know what, we need a solution now. And we need to get them, it's a choice between getting off the internet or for them to be in a safe space. But for me, I was thinking that's really a shame, right? Because then I'm really afraid that's where it stops, because then they are not able to, basically it's akin to saying, hey, ladies, go home, because that's where you'll be safe, right? Because the public space is not meant for you. It's unsafe. So why don't we relegate you into the domestic sphere in your safe space, which is really old school. I mean, it puts us back in time. So, basically this is the trend that's happening, and lock profiles is happening also for, collectives that are trying to be more active and protest against authoritarian cultures, which is very much in Katie's, area. And that basically puts them again into this little box. They can't get amplified, and it protects them at the same time. It doesn't allow them the power that they should have, right? So I think that's one of the things I struggle with, of celebrating and not. The same thing with data as currency. People are like, yucks, you can't say that. You can't. In fact, that's terrible. In the West, we have the privilege of like dismissing that. I'm not going to trade my data. And on the other hand, if you don't have anything else and that's your way to get online, sure, you don't mind if Facebook breaks net neutrality and you have finally something to trade with. And that's what's happening, right? A lot of these populations are getting online by using data as currency. So do we condemn that, or do we, in our little happy spaces of, liberal Western democracies where we are well off and we are able to do that? Or can we understand and yet actually feel very queasy that we know that's not the right thing, right? So this is the thing. Or the third element is friction. They talk about frictionless apps, okay? And it's basically the smooth transition. So it's very user friendly. It's a sort of a thing for the design communities, but strategic friction will give you pause before, because a lot of people don't have are not enculturated with banking practices. We have like 1.7 billion people who have never banked in their life, right? But so they do need inscribed friction, but on the other hand, that can make it cumbersome and they can drop off because it's too. So the question is, these features are very fascinating because they come with trade-offs. And I think that what would be useful is to map the trade-offs and see how do we like strengthen the areas that we want to, delve into. How do we understand this is just a stopgap measure, but let's not give up on the bigger fight where the digital space is a public space for all right? And so we shouldn't be like relegating people into their little corners and chats so they can be fine, which is half the world's population, and I think that would be something we need to proceed with, in which case we don't condemn and have this sort of black and white answers like, I condemn you for not giving up Facebook, how could you still be on Facebook, right? I mean, we need to like take a step back and say, all right, let's start understanding why people do what they do, despite what is looked upon as ridiculously high risks, extraordinary harms that they could bring to themselves. Let's understand, right? And there's usually a rationale, which is not something which is black and white.
I agree with everything that Dre and Payal said. I would add that if we're saying, okay, you absolutely should almost immediately oppose anything, I think any sort of program that is presuming that institutions and organizations that are already under-resourced are going to be able to carry the weight of the digital divide solution program, whether they be libraries or schools or teachers or community groups. If those institutions aren't receiving ample funding and support, that immediately no. And I'm not saying that like all library solutions are bad or something. I mean, I love libraries. I love librarians. I love all these groups. But it seems like that is sort of especially in the US, programs kind of go to those without necessarily saying, oh yeah, we're going to need, 2 extra staff people, or, that person's going to need to be moved from part-time to full-time in order to facilitate this. And so that's something I get a little bit concerned about when I hear things like that. And that's also true in international development context, that they just want to like insert these programs without formally resourcing them more. I think any sort of program, and this sort of goes to our last question that we'll discuss in a moment, that anything that puts particular parameters on the outcomes. And Lydia already posted this piece that I had a number of years ago that I talked about this a lot, that when we say that meaningful access is what we say it is, like, okay, if they are reading the news, they are searching for information about voting, that they're engaging in they're searching for a job, they're taking an online class, that's all good stuff to do on the internet. And bad stuff to do on the internet is play games, watch videos, watch movies, chat with friends, screw around, as if we all don't do those things all day long, right? And so whenever you see a program that is presuming and defining what meaningful outcomes and use habits will be, that is something, that doesn't mean the whole program is bad, but that helping people that are kind of thinking that way jump back and be like, you know what, who cares? Let people do what they're going to do on the internet. And the big proof in this too is that people learn a lot when they're doing fun things, right? And that you can have meaningful capital enhancement activities via silly chats and games. So those would be my 2 things to say, keep your eye out for.
This is Lydia. Thank you all for sharing that, I spend a lot of my time talking to people about why techno-solutionism isn't just often a failure, but it can actually be outright dangerous for marginalized communities. We have a few more minutes left in our conversation. So if you are here listening to this and you have a burning question, like now is your chance to ask any burning question. I don't see any in the Q&A and I haven't seen any in the chat. So you've got a little bit of time to percolate, but not that much time. But lightning round, the last question that I wanted to pose to the three of you before we have to wrap up is if each of you could talk briefly about what it is that we actually need to do in order to ensure that all people can thrive in our digital present and future. I know it's a huge question. We could spend a week or a month talking about it. But briefly, top thing you want someone to take away. Top thing that you want someone to take away. What would that be?
All right, shall I go? This is a pregnant pause. You're like, all right, the politeness index. All right. Okay, for me, it's something extremely boring. I went a few weeks ago for this UNESCO launch for the report called EdTech Tragedy. But there was a lot of resistance for its launch because guess what? UNESCO is now made up of half of them are tech companies, and they're not very happy with that report. The problem is my main thing is that we need more independent, autonomous, global governance bodies to serve as watchdogs. The last time we came up with these kinds of institutions was post World War II. I mean, it's about time. And, we have a lot of problems to solve, which are global in nature, which is, climate crisis, the pandemic. So we're talking about the health, inequality, all of this, financial reform. I mean, patriarchy, which is pervasive across, cyber harassment, and, all of this is pervasive. So what we are failing to have is autonomous funding bodies, which are allowed to do the good work where they put the citizens, where they put people's interests at the center, and where governments, where other civic actors all pool in their energies, understanding it could be critical, but it is the only way to sustain democracy. And democracy, when I say that, is also, the digital has become an extension, has very much become part of the, governance of democracy. So yeah, that would be my thing. It's very boring, but very, very essential is imagining, and it's about time, global institutions. And I'm really afraid because particularly being in Europe, I notice that there's more and more funding, like astronomical amounts of money is going towards this European project. There's a reinvigoration of the fortress European mentality because, oh my God, they're coming for us. So it's interesting because they frame the innovation, the future of digital, the future of innovation as if it's European centered and there's nothing else. It's almost like there's no global supply chain. It just falls off. It starts at Europe and ends at Europe. And I am really, really concerned about that trend, So so we need to look at the money. It's all about the political economy of this and making sure that they are watchdogs that will look after the interests and principles that we hold dear. It is democracy, fair participation, justice, and the like. So.
Katie, Dre?
Lydia, I would point to work like you're doing, that although, it's a big promise, how can we help all? I mean, the thing is, if we are being inclusive and meeting everyone's needs first, that it's going to end up including more people. And so that is about as optimistic and positive as I can get in this realm, that in general, the more things we do to make sure that more people can get online, it's going to amplify, hopefully. I wish I could say something more positive. And I love the question, can we undo centuries of racist policies? I mean, I wish, but there isn't a lot of space for optimism in this area, unfortunately. Maybe Andre has something incredible to say, though.
I do not. What I will say, though, is that I am unconcerned with building infrastructures per se, in part because the building of infrastructures is a decades, if not, as the person mentioned, centuries long project that requires massive investment that many minoritized communities don't have, right? Investment in terms of policy, material, and raw resources and everything else. What I do instead is talk about what we can do in the now, the post-present. And I say that because in many ways we have excelled at occupying the creases, the corners, the interstices, the gaps in between infrastructures, that in many ways, that's the places where we prefer to be, because those are the spaces we have carved out where we can be most clearly seen by ourselves as worthy of humanity and investment, right? And so, do we need to build out infrastructures? At some point, yes, but at this point, I don't know if that's possible. What we do need to build out instead is resources for everyday life, right? Informational. One of my favorite examples is the drivers in, I want to say, South Asia. I don't remember particularly which part, but they were part of a taxi hail rideshare company. And the rideshare company demanded that in order to pick up fares, they had to be at a specific location in their car waiting for the fare, which meant that they were often sitting for hours at a time in a queue with no access to bathroom, food, or anything else. So what some smart person did was figured out a way to spoof the network so that the drivers could sit at their favorite tea shop with the bathroom and their folk and congregate, but also be present at the same time in that infrastructure where the infrastructure said they needed to be, so they could revive themselves and have access to a means of actually making more money. And I want to see more things like that, where we don't necessarily break the infrastructure, but we shape it in ways that are amenable to how we do. Right. And I think from those perspectives, if you disrupt enough, if you innovate enough from a perspective of the underserved, eventually the infrastructure will change. My favorite example is curb cuts. Right. If nobody really understood why it was necessary to put curb cuts in at intersections in the United States.
Of non-disabled people.
Right. They're used more by non-disabled people than they are by disabled people. Right there. And so that to me is something that if you build for the least of us, everyone will profit at some point, which requires a major turning point in the and how governments and corporate entities understand themselves, right? Which is the hardest part. So the last piece I would say is, and there needs to be a given what's going on in the United States, I was going to say regime change, and I don't think that's the right term, right? There needs to be a paradigm shift. Right. I mentioned transparency earlier, and I think that's super important, but I would also love to see a transparency in terms of particularity. Be clear in who these resources will benefit the most. And if you do that, then people have a better, instead of clothing them in words like freedom and democracy and justice and access, say, well, if we build this, this group of people will benefit, but this other group of people will also benefit as well. And if you're transparent about that, then people have the capacity to make their own decisions about whether or not they will participate though. But that's a huge ask. Right? That's an infrastructural ask, right? And I don't know if we're necessarily there, but I think as researchers, the work of the people on the screen has done a lot to push that perspective forward. And so I appreciate being in conversation with y'all.
Thank you so much, Andre, Payal, and Katie. This has been a fantastic conversation. I'm truly privileged and honored to have been able to help facilitate it. Thank you to everyone who has attended, and thank you to everybody who helped to organize this and make it possible. To Anne, David, Heather, and all others working behind the scenes to make this series on governing conversations available and open to the public